Will the Dogs show up this time? Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the Sugar Bowl. We've got Georgia taking on Baylor. We also have Palmer Toms on the line from Dogs 247 Sports. Would like you to check out the videos here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. And if you like what you see, like the videos, comment, share the videos on social media, and subscribe. Palmer, how you doing today?
Doing well, getting ready to head down to New Orleans. Team arrives there today. I'm getting down there tomorrow for the first bowl practice, and so ready to get down to the Big Easy.
All right, let's clean up some business in regards to always needing, especially when it's a talented team that has NFL draft prospects that are underclassmen. That always has to be addressed, and such is the case along the offensive line, what has been considered one of the better offensive lines in college football the past couple of years. And a few guys need to work out and show out for the NFL scouts and prepare themselves for the NFL draft. They've made that decision.
Yeah, starting left tackle Andrew Thomas, projected to be a top 10, top 5 pick in the 2020 NFL draft come this spring. He's already declared that he is going to forego his senior season. He's been a 3-year starter on the offensive line, so he'll be out of this bowl game. And then Georgia will also be missing starting right tackle Isaiah Wilson, who has started for 2 straight years on the offensive line. He's also going to the NFL draft, foregoing his final 2 years. He's a redshirt sophomore. So he'll be missing the game as well. There's some questions about whether or not Ben Cleveland will be available. And you know, Georgia's had a slew of injuries on the offensive line. So Ben Cleveland rumored to be academically ineligible. So that would be another big hit for the offensive line. And then, you know, just it'll be a great opportunity for, you know, with new offensive line coach Matt Luke in play, and those 2 tackles, you know, your bookends on the offensive line, knowing that they're headed to the NFL. It'll be a good way for Georgia, Kirby Smart, Matt Luke to kind of just test out, you know, some potential lineups that they could be seeing next year.
Yeah, the best of both worlds is that you win the game and you also get to experiment with new concepts, new formulas, especially along the offensive line where the chemistry has to be better than any unit on the field. If you can get young players into the game against the top 10 team and on a big stage and prepare them for the next year and still win the game, that's the formula. That hasn't been the formula, at least last year, of course, is a big favorite against Texas, but we'll get to that in just a second because we've got some more possible personnel concerns. Running back, obviously, at Georgia has been probably the best position in the country, or certainly one of the top 2 or 3, not just in terms of quality, but in terms of quantity and depth. But there could be some hits coming there as well.
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of people are looking at DeAndre Swift. A lot of people looked at him before those early announcements came out for, you know, from the tackles that they would be missing the game. A lot of people written, you know, off that DeAndre Swift would not play in the bowl game, given his injury situation heading into and during the SEC championship. He came out on Twitter and said that, you know, he has not made an NFL decision, that he'll be making that after the bowl game. We have not seen practice. But, you know, from what we heard from Kirby Smart, he's been practicing. We will get to see practice when they arrive in New Orleans tomorrow for bowl practices there. So, you know, a lot of questions will be answered there about, you know, Swift's status for this bowl game. Brian Herrien also been rumored possibly out due to off-field issues. And James Cook was arrested following final exams in Athens. So, you know, again, nothing has been confirmed about any of those 3 guys' statuses for this game. If they play, I'm sure, you know, they're talented guys. They've been 1, 2, and 3 all season for a reason. But if they're not able to go, it'll be Zamir White and Kenny McIntosh carrying the load. And I think a lot of people, again, this is a situation like that offensive line. A lot of people really, really think that DeAndre Swift is headed to the NFL next year. Brian Herrien's a senior, so he'll be gone. You know, it's kind of a passing of the torch. And, you know, Zamir White's going to be counted on heavily next year, along with some of the, you know, freshman incomers and Kenny McIntosh too. McIntosh is true freshman this year, and he's a 4-star recruit. So he's gotten some touches this year. He has not gotten touches in games against a top 10 opponent like they'll be playing here against Baylor. And if that's how the cards are played, that he'll be in the game. So it'll be interesting to see. A lot of questions will be answered when we get to New Orleans and get to see a little bit of practice, and then certainly answered on game day.
And this is where this situation at Georgia is different than it is for almost every team in the country, is what you just outlined concerning McIntosh and White's recruiting status. So most teams lose their star running back, and then it's a 2-star behind him, or it's another decent player, and then they've got a significant drop off. They can't lose 3 running backs. Now, in terms of productivity and proving it on the field, there's a huge off the cliff drop off here. But when you just talk about sheer talent, speed, ability, running the 40, doing all the things that the scouts evaluated and the coaches coming out of high school, there's really not much of a drop off. If at all, you're talking about 2 of the top 5 to 10 running backs in the nation coming out of high school who would fill those spots. So it's a different situation at Georgia. It's not a talent drop off, it's just an experience and productivity drop off.
Absolutely. And, it's been that way the past couple of seasons. You saw the 2017 team move from Nick Chubb and Sonny Michel onto Elijah Holyfield and DeAndre Swift. Well, Chubb and Michel went for 1,000 yards each in 2017. And what did Holyfield and Swift do in 2018? They did the exact same. They both went for 1,000 yards. So it's really become RBU. And, it's a passing of the torch, essentially.
Got Palmer Thomas on the line from Dogs 247 Sports. Encourage you to check out the site, check out his work covering Georgia football, of course, as the Bulldogs take on the Baylor Bears in the Sugar Bowl. So those are the questions we can deal with where we've got some tangibles. There's some logic and sense to it. What makes no sense is trying to figure out if guys are going to be motivated to play in the Sugar Bowl. Because on one hand, college football playoff or bust is the aim for this particular team and program, but at the same time, it is the Sugar Bowl. It's the biggest bowl game given to a non-playoff team in the SEC, matched up against the next seed in the Big 12, and of course, that's Baylor this year. So on one hand, the thought process might be, this team got embarrassed last year as a double-digit favorite against Texas. Maybe they come out smoking and fuming and ready to play and prove a point because they had to hear it all off season about losing to Texas. But then on the other hand, we were just here last year. We didn't get to the playoff. We didn't win the SEC. Does it really matter to us? We're either going to finish 12-2 and number 5 in the country, or we're going to finish 11-3 and number 9 in the country. That's maybe the determining factor here in regards to any kind of tangible scope of this game. So this is an impossible question, Palmer, but how motivated is this team going to be?
Yeah, I mean, last year it was very apparent. Georgia lost 28-21 to Texas. It was a talented Texas team, but, obviously there's a reason that Georgia was in playoff contention and Texas was hoping for, not necessarily they needed a win. They needed to, their ceiling was the Sugar Bowl. They finished with 4 losses on the year, and that was with a win in the bowl game. Georgia finished with 3 losses with that loss. So, coming in last year, very similar situation, where Georgia was heavy favorite, and, kind of had written off Texas. Didn't necessarily have as many guys sitting out of the bowl game as they do this year. DeAndre Baker, Thorpe Award-winning cornerback, sat out of that game in preparation for the NFL draft. Mentioned that they'll have 2 guys sitting out this year. But the guys that were on the field didn't necessarily look like they were, ready to play. I think a lot of guys had watched the semifinal games that had taken place a couple days prior to their game and, saw Notre Dame get blown out and said, well, we should have been there. And, they were ready to talk the talk, but they did not go out and, prove that. I think a lot of questions, because of that have come up about, well, Kirby and, Georgia, and they lost, the SEC championship like they did last year. Now, granted, this year they got blown out. LSU handedly won that game. Last year, it was a more heartbreaking loss to Alabama. It was a chance for them to get that monkey off their back, and they didn't. They blew that lead. and they, felt like it was a consolation prize ending up in the Sugar Bowl. Well, this year they got it handed to them, and LSU very clearly was the better team on that field. And so Georgia's going to end up in the Sugar Bowl. And so Kirby was asked, immediately. We've talked to him twice since the SEC championship. Once the day that the bowls were announced, that Sunday after the championship games, and then once on early signing day. And one of the first questions he was asked was about that motivation. He's actually asked twice and kind of gave two different answers. First time he was, said that's something that we'll address in the bowl period, bowl practices and stuff. But that's shouldn't be an issue. And then it kind of came up again, and he said, hey, we're taking a different approach to it this year. Last year when we got back, I had every staff member, every, support staff, everybody sit down, take a couple of notes on, if we're in this situation again, playing in a non-playoff game, how would we handle it differently? And so he said now that they're in that situation, they've pulled out those notes and, are taking a different approach to it. And, he kind of alluded to the fact that some guys weren't necessarily motivated. Some guys weren't ready to play. And he said, this year it's not about, what you've done before. It's not necessarily about, how talented you are. It's about how much you want to be there. And he said, to him and his staff this year, that's going to be a lot more important. Who wants to be there versus, how talented you are. And so I think there's a chance that, I would assume that the motivation is better this year. So we're probably still going to be seeing a lot of Georgia's normal players. But, like I mentioned, there's a chance that, some guys are looking ahead to the NFL, maybe sitting out, maybe not. I think Kirby's going to be a lot more ready to be putting in a guy that's, a second, third string in place of a first stringer that, has his mind elsewhere. I think he's going to be very willing to do that this year, given how last year turned out and kind of how that hung around the program all year. It's a year later and we're still talking about, how much of an egg they laid against Texas.
You can get my playoff and bowl predictions. You grab the link in the description section below and grab them right there. 58% against the spread this year, 79% against the money line. We got Palmer Thomas on the line from Dogs 247 Sports, talking Georgia and Baylor at the Sugar Bowl. For Baylor, they were in the college football playoff hunt as well. But considering where they've been and what's expected, you would consider it to be just a completely different motivational factor. This program was 1-11 2 years ago, 7-6 last year. They beat Vandy in a bowl game. Then they come back this year, and they just I saw slices of Baylor football throughout the year. I would check out an overtime here or part of a fourth quarter here because they were constantly in games against mid-tier opponents. They beat West Virginia on a Thursday night by 3 points at home. West Virginia team that won 5 games. They needed all sorts of tricks and smoke and mirrors to get by TCU in like triple overtime, 29-23. They beat Iowa State on a last-second field goal. This team did everything right, basically, except hold on to a 25-point lead against Oklahoma. I know you've seen the big games against the Sooners, which was a big showdown for the first place in the Big 12. They blow a 25-point lead. They lose to Jalen Hurts and company. They come back in the championship game. They take Oklahoma to overtime. So that's a team that's playing in the playoffs. So Baylor, on one hand, doesn't have the personnel to match up with Georgia or the elite teams in the country. I don't think there's any question about that, but they seem to have stepped up to the one team in their conference that is capable of playing at that level. So it's a team to be reckoned with.
Yeah, I mean, to me, from the bits of Baylor football that I've seen this year, they very much played to their competition. Like you mentioned, the close wins over West Virginia and TCU and Iowa State, and then, playing with the, Big 12 champion and, who's been king of the Big 12 for the last couple of seasons in Oklahoma, taking them to the wire both times and, having a lead against them both times. And then you mentioned, where Baylor has been in, Matt Rule's first year. They were a 1-11 and, now they've turned it around and they're 11-2 and making their second Sugar Bowl appearance all time. First one was 1957. So we're talking 60 years ago. Meanwhile, Georgia was here last year. So, the motivation should be there for Baylor. It'll be interesting to see for them who comes out at quarterback. Of course, Charlie Brewer, played in that Big 12 championship. He started 29 of the last 30 for the Bears, but he was taken out of that game in the second quarter with and putting into concussion protocol. Rumors are out of Baylor practice that he is good to go, should be good to go for the bowl game. If it's not him, it'll be Jerry Bohannon and Jacob Zeno, combination of the two. Those two kind of teamed up. Bohannon's more of the running type, but was first to go in the game when Brewer was taken out. Zeno threw for more yards, 159 yards and a touchdown against the Sooners. So it'll be interesting to see what Baylor comes out with at quarterback. They got a deep group of running backs: JaMychal Hasty, John Lovett, wide receivers that were all Big 12. Denzel receiver in FBS the last 3 seasons to record 8 touchdowns, at least 8 touchdowns in each of those years. So he's been consistent. Tyquan Thornton's also a threat there. But just looking at Baylor, a couple of things that stand out to me. Offensive line allows over 2.5 sacks per game. Gave up 6 to Oklahoma in that conference championship. Georgia's done a great job of getting pressure on opposing quarterbacks. The sack numbers necessarily aren't super high, but they've been getting lots and lots of pressure. Of course, havoc was a huge emphasis for Georgia this offseason, and they've really stepped that up. I mean, looking at the numbers from last year to this year, it's incredible to see the change that they had there. Especially in the outside linebacker group. I mean, you've got, I believe last year, DeAndre Walker was top on the team with like 15 quarterback hurries. I think you've got 5 or 6 guys that are above that number this year. So, just seeing that, that's something that stands out to me as a area that Georgia could capitalize on. But I think, with mentioning the Georgia defense, you've got a great Baylor defense as well. Veteran defense with only one underclassman starter. That's redshirt sophomore linebacker Terrell Bernard, who leads the team with 107 tackles. So, very veteran defense. James Lynch is a consensus All-American, Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. He's, top 10 in the country in tackles for loss and sacks. So, Graylin Arnold is top 5 in the country in interceptions. He's also an All-American. So, I think we're going to see a very 12 offense and an SEC defense, and then an SEC offense and a Big 12 defense. It can go a lot of ways. You can end up with an SEC type game where it's more low scoring, the 28-21 game that, Georgia and Texas played last year. But you can also end up in the 50s and 60s like Georgia and Oklahoma did 2 years ago. So, this one's interesting because the offenses for both these teams haven't necessarily been great as of late, but they've got the talent, whereas the defenses have been really good. This could turn out to be, the last time Georgia and Baylor played, it was a 15-3 Georgia win. It could oddly turn out being a score like that. That was a 1989 game. Georgia's won all 4 previous meetings against Baylor, all 4 of which came in Athens. You could see a score, how these two teams match up with the great defenses and shaky offenses. You could see a score like 15-3.
Yeah, so the Big 12 and the SEC signed a contract several years ago, and so we've had a good run of about 7 years of these games between the Big 12 and the SEC, and typically, the SEC always makes the college football playoff, so that 1 seed is always gone there. Then the 2 seed comes and plays the Big 12. Now, the Big 12 has sometimes made the playoff, sometimes has not, so a few years ago, in fact, you had an 8-4 Auburn team kind of made their way through the tie-breaking process to get to the Sugar Bowl and played an Oklahoma team that was the top 5 in the nation, and that wasn't a real competitive game. So sometimes the seeding's been a little bit unfair in favor of the Big 12, but typically it's about where it needs to be. And you had, Texas and Georgia, obviously the runner-up in their respective conferences last year. Texas wins that by a touchdown. the playoff has taken over the Sugar Bowl spot a few times, so it hasn't been year to year. But that Oklahoma win over Auburn that I alluded to a few years ago with Baker Mayfield leading the charge. Ole Miss crushed Oklahoma State the year before that. You had the playoff take it over the year before that. And in the first year, Oklahoma beat Alabama. So even though the contract's been signed for like 7 years, the playoff has interrupted the Big 12 and the SEC a number of times. So we're only looking at 3 results right there. So not a whole lot to glean from that at this point. But Georgia and Texas getting together last year, and the Bulldogs are back against Baylor, the runner-up in the Big 12. Should be interesting. I think the Big 12 plays better defense than it used to. All you have to do is look at the scores. It's not SEC defense. They don't have the talent across the board. They have it in spots. Baylor doesn't. But as you mentioned, James Lynch, players in the secondary, they've put together a defensive effort that's been pretty darn good this year, despite not having the top 5 talent that Georgia does. They've got more like top 30, 35 talent. We'll see what happens when the two teams get together on New Year's night. Palmer, we appreciate you stopping by. Have a great trip to New Orleans and enjoy the game.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.